Hey guys, Zomfox here, and today it is time to do the top 10 best players of the 2024 UFL season. Now this is something I've done the previous 2 years with the USFL, and am going to be continuing it with the UFL. Now of course, this is a very tough list to make, as we're having to whittle down the entire league to just 10 guys. And especially ranking those 10 guys, as let alone finding 10 players that deserve to be on this list, but ranking them is a very tough thing to do. So of course, this is about everything they did last season. Now, it is not just the regular season, as the postseason will matter, but naturally for guys that ended up missing the playoffs, I'm not going to force them to be outside the top 5. Just like I've done the previous couple years, it is mainly about just how well you played in the regular season, with the postseason being that thing that kind of helps you out a little bit. So of course, this is going to be a controversial list, as some people might expect certain guys to be on it. I do have one really big hot take on this list, or really two of them. So make sure you enjoy it and be on this wild ride. Let me know down below in the comments what your top 10 is as well. And without further ado, let's get started with the honorable mentions, and that is going to be, once again, 2 tight ends. Yes, I'm kind of doing the same thing I did last year, but I really couldn't pick either Sal Cannella or Jay Sternberger to be on this top 10 list. Now, just like last year we saw with, Jay Sternberger and Sage Surratt, it was very much a question of, do you prefer the guy that is your normal tight end or the guy that plays more like a deep threat receiver? Essentially, Sal Cannella was a better pure tight end in a sense that he was your safety blanket. He was the guy that you knew you could throw to and get a catch and get some yardage. Whereas Sternberger, when he caught the ball, he was going. Essentially, yes, Sternberger was the all-UFL tight end, but it was a very controversial decision, as a lot of people actually think Cannella deserved it. And it was a very close call, but in my opinion, I couldn't really justify putting either of these guys on the list. Though, if you were going to put one, I feel like you have to put the other one. So because of that, just like last year, I'm going to be putting them as the honorable mentions. Now, coming in at number 10 is going to be Kai Nacua. Now, this might be a shock to a lot of people. I am a Panthers fan. I'm going to be honest, I never fully bought the DPOY hype he had. I just never did. I understood that for most of the year, it was pretty much a given he was going to win DPOY, but even as somebody who watched every Panthers game, I didn't see it for sure. Now, I say that as a DPOY, not as a great player. He still was clearly the best DB in the league this past season, and definitely deserves to be this number 10 spot. The fact is he was first in interceptions, he was tied there. He had tied for the most passes defended as well, and he was also up there in solo tackles, being in the top 10. Now, while his playoff game wasn't the most crazy thing, not really many Panthers played that well in the defense, but all in all, I think he definitely deserves to be on this list. Again, if it wasn't for the last couple of weeks with a certain player we'll get to later, he would have been the DPOY winner. Now, while I do think that there were a couple other defenders better than him that should have gotten DPOY over him if the said player didn't end up winning it, but again, Nacua still deserves to be on this list. Don't take this as any hate. I still have him on my list because he clearly deserves it. It's just that I know some people are probably going to expect him to be like around the top 5 for how good he was. I personally have him at 10th, and I guess as a mini spoiler, I have him as the 4th best defender this past season, which might be a hot take, but I stand by it. Now, coming in at number 9 is going to be De'Veon Smith. Now, this might be a bit of a shocker, but yes, I am putting him at number 9. Look, this is somebody who, especially in the latter half of the season, really kind of, stepped it up, as he kind of helped Luis Perez have a actual, great overall offense, minus the questionable O-line. De'Veon Smith was a really solid player. He actually finished 2nd in scrimmage yards, as he had well over 600, and he was still tied 8th for fumbles, which isn't the most insane. You'd like that to be only 1 fumble. But that was really his only weakness. The fact is he was 1st in rushing attempts, 3rd in rushing yards, and he was still tied for 6th in yards per rush, minimum 25 attempts. Now, yes, his TDs were a bit on the lacking side. He only had 3 total TDs, and those were both all rushing. But I still believe he deserves to be on this list. Again, it's not like he was playing on a team that had, an unbelievable offensive line. He wasn't playing on Birmingham. He wasn't playing, on like St. Louis, who after their early week 1 struggles ended up being a really solid unit. He was playing on a Renegades team that at points was very questionable whether the O-line was decent or not. And he was able to put up some decent numbers, and I think he really deserves to be on this list. I know some people might expect him to be lower and might say that either the tight end should be above him. I don't think so for sure. I think it's pretty clear he would have been all UFL running back if it hadn't been for the guy that was. Number 8, Jacob Sailors. Now, Sailors comes in at number 8 because of the fact that he was just a better player than De'Veon Smith, but I don't think he was necessarily light years ahead. Look, I think both running backs are pretty close. It's obvious that one guy was better. Jacob Sailors only had 0 fumbles, despite having one of the highest carry marks in the entire league. He had 94 rushing attempts and had 23 receptions, yet never fumbled the ball. He had the most carries without a single fumble. He was second in yards per rush, and if you eliminate Adrian Martinez, who was a quarterback, he was number 1. And of course, that's minimum 25 attempts. And that's really insane with his 4.9 yards per rush. He was tied 8th in receiving TDs while also being tied for 2nd in rushing TDs. Essentially, he was just a better De'Veon Smith. Some of that was the O-line, some of that was the offense having a lot of checkdowns, but what he was just really good. He might not have had as many, receiving yards and all that, but he had a very solid amount of total touchdowns at 8, which is insane. And overall, he was an incredible player, and I think definitely deserves to be on this list. I think 8 is a very solid spot for him. Now, coming in at number 7 is going to be Devontae Beckett. Now, this is one of the ones that might be a shock. I know it's, he's one of the 2 linebackers that were really good on San Antonio, but I'm going to go with Beckett on this list. He was 3rd in tackles, tied for 2nd in solo tackles, tied for 7th in assisted tackles, and tied for 2nd in TFLs. Essentially, he was just a slightly worse version than the guy that we'll get to in a little bit, which is nothing to scoff at because, again, this is still insane. Beckett also had 2 forced fumbles, which, of course, was tied for the lead in the league, but that's like a bunch of players had that, about 10 players had that, so I didn't want to put that there. And he did have a forced fumble in the playoffs as well. He had 11 tackles in the playoffs as well. He was a really solid player, one of the better defenders in the entire postseason. But again, he deserves this spot mainly for his solo tackles. 44 solo tackles is nothing to scoff at, and 9 TFLs was pretty huge as well. I mean, that's insane. And the fact that it's tied for 2nd shows just how good he was. I think he was the better of the linebackers. I think that's why he was an all-UFL linebacker. I think he deserved to be on this list above Nacua. I think that if I were to choose one guy for a defense, I'd rather have Beckett. So because of that, he comes in at number 7. Now, number 6 is going to be Hakeem Butler. Now, this might be a hot take putting him this I guess, low on the list. But I think 6 is where he deserves to be. He was incredible this past season. He was the OPOY winner, but I've said it before, I think it was a very debatable OPOY award winner. Now, he was an all-UFL receiver, which he definitely deserved. He was 1st in receiving yards despite having very few the last couple weeks of the season. 2nd in yards after catch, tied for 2nd in receiving TDs, tied 4th in receptions, 12th in reception percentage. Really solid. I mean, it's just a really solid season. He had 58 receiving yards in the postseason game. Now, the postseason game was one of those weird ones. A lot of people would say that the best way to describe it is what if. What if he had made all those catches? It would have been an incredible game. Instead, it was just, a decent game where he had a couple great catches but dropped a couple of ones. And that was most of the season. He had a decent amount of drops that kind of hurt him. Overall, he was still a very incredible player. That's why he is number 6 on this list. I don't think this is as much as like last year's OPOY win with Mark Thompson in the USFL, where it was very clear, hey, that's a top 3 player. I think that the OPOY award, it wasn't going to go to an MVP. Again, they're not going to do the double dipping where they have an MVP and OPOY be the same player. So obviously you have those guys that kind of get screwed over for this. And then, of course, I think that there was an OPOY that should have gotten it over him, arguably. So I'm putting him at number 6. Now, number 5 is Willie Harvey Jr. This is the slightly better version of Devontae Beckett right here. This is somebody who not only was really solid at TFLs, but also passes defended and sacks. He had 4 sacks, which is actually tied for 16th, but what's impressive is he actually got 34 yards from those sacks, which is actually top 10. Now, he was tied for 2nd in TFLs, just like Beckett was. Now, solo tackles, he's a bit lower at 4th, but he led the entire league in tackles. Yes, that was helped by Frank Ginda being hurt, but with Frank Ginda being out, Willie Harvey really stepped it up as being that number 1 linebacker in the league, and his 6 passes defended actually was tied for 6th in the league as well. He also had 2 forced fumbles, so all around, this is somebody who was very versatile. He had multiple forced fumbles, multiple passes defended, multiple TFLs, multiple sacks, and the most amount of tackles in the league. I think this is crazy if you don't have him in the top 5, in my opinion. I think that he clearly is the number 1 defender that didn't win DPOY. I think that when you look at what he did with the Battlehawks, it was incredible. He was a huge reason why that Battlehawks defense was so dominant those last couple of weeks. And if it wasn't for their offense, laying a couple of huge eggs back to back, they could have been in the championship, and this defense could have potentially held Birmingham to an even lower score than San Antonio did. But we'll never know. It is a what if, but what isn't a what if is Willie Harvey Jr. being number 5 on my list. Now, number 4 is going to be Breeland Speaks, your Defensive Player of the Year winner. Breeland Speaks is back-to-back on this list. He was on the list last year. I believe I had him at 7th, and now he's at number 4 for the UFL. See, the issue we had with the USFL was that the second half of the season, he tapered off. I said that early on in this year, or not early on this year, but during, the whole end of the season. That was his biggest issue last year. This year, he didn't taper off. He went off. He basically stole the DPOY from his teammate. Again, I think that it probably should have gone to Willie Harvey over kind of cool if Speaks didn't win it. The point is, the last couple of weeks, Speaks just went off. Especially the game against Houston was the big one, where it was a huge reason why they won was him. He ended up finishing as the All-UFL defensive end, one of them, DPOY. First in sacks, but what was impressive was he was the only guy to have more than 7. Now, he was first in sack yards. He was the only guy that had 50. He had 76. First in TFLs, only player with at least 10 TFLs. So it's not a sense of it's just that the stats are good. It's that he's hitting stats that nobody else was even close on. I mean, second place in sacks was 7. Second place in sack yards was 47, I believe. Second place in TFLs was 9. He was clearly the best player on defense this year. Now, his postseason game, disappointing. But his regular season was remarkable and showed just how dominant he could be. This is really the closest season in spring football we've gotten to Chris Odom's 2022. While I wouldn't say this was better than Odom's 2022 because Odom also had those insane blocks on kicks, but I'd say this is definitely the second best defensive season we've seen in spring football, which is impressive, but it's number 4. Now, when we get to number 3, let me explain, because this is definitely the biggest hot take I have on the list. It's a huge hot take. Number 3, I have Justin Hall, wide receiver from the Roughnecks. Here is the reason. Justin Hall had Jarrett Garantano, Reed Sinnett, and Nolan Henderson throwing to him. Nolan Henderson's a really great runner, has a lot of potential, but as a passer, he's not really that great. He had 3 QBs who, passing-wise, were not really great, and 2 of them, Sinnett and Garantano, are pretty much universally viewed as 2 of the 5 worst QBs to play this past season. I mean, I had my worst QB list come out a couple weeks ago, and they were both on it, and I don't think anyone would be upset about it, that those 2 guys were on it. That's who he had throwing to him, okay? Even Henderson, who again wasn't really that insane a passer, he was just really good on the ground, but also slightly better passer than Manny Wilkins, a lot of people would say. He only had it for 2 games. Yet Justin Hall finished first in yards after catch by a mile. I mean, you thought Breland Speaks was bad. Nobody else had over 300. He had 372. He was tied for first in receptions, third in receiving yards, tied for 12th in yards per reception, tied for 8th in receiving TDs, 5th in reception percentage, which is insane. Now, his tied for 6th in fumbles did hurt, but he didn't lose any of those fumbles, so that does kind of help his case a little bit that he didn't actually cause any turnovers. I said it before, he was snubbed off the All-UFL team. It clearly should have been him. Again, I'm a Panthers fan. No way Marcus Sims should have made that list over Justin Hall. Marcus Sims made those huge highlight catches every once in a while. Well, not once in a while, every game. And David Davis had a couple highlights, but Justin Hall, I think, was the best receiver this past season. I think that when you consider what team he was on versus Hakeem Butler, that's why I give it to Hall. When you look at Hall, he was on a team with a far worse offensive line, a far worse quarterback group, an overall just worse team. Yet he was able to put up these numbers is incredible. Look, when you have other incredible players, it helps you, right? When you have a Jacob Sailors at running back who's going to demand a lot of attention, it can allow receivers to get extra separation or have to deal with less players on a play action. Mark Thompson was not the same Mark Thompson he was last year, so he was a lot worse this year. And that naturally hurt Hall because more people are focusing on Hall than they are Mark Thompson. When you talk about the quarterback, again, A.J. McCarron versus Jarrett Garantano or Reed Sinnett, when we talk about early in the season, one of them is clearly better than the rest. Then the O-line, one team clearly had a better O-line than the other one. Yet Justin Hall put up the numbers he did. Again, I know this is a hot take because he wasn't an all-UFL player, but I think he was super snubbed for it. I think it was just a narrative of David Davis being on this terrible Showboats team, and then you have Marcus Sims making those highlight catches every week. But when you talk about an overall receiver, Justin Hall was the number 1 guy this past season. I think he deserves the 3 spot. I think he deserves to be high on the list. I think if you were to, actually look at who was the best offensive player that wasn't a quarterback, it was Justin Hall. I think he deserves to be on this list. I think he deserves to be multiple spots higher than Hakeem Butler, honestly, which I know is a hot take, but I stand by it. I have him at number 3. Number 2 is Luis Perez. Shouldn't be a shock to anybody. Luis Perez was insane. First in passing yards, only player with 2,000 passing yards. He had 2,300. First in passing TDs, tied for 7th in yards per pass. 4th in completion percentage, 2nd in passer rating, tied for 4th in interceptions, which isn't great, tied for 6th in sacks taken, and one of 2 QBs to start all 10 games. The other QB to start all 10 games was one of the weaker ones in the league, and that was Jordan Ta'amu. Luis Perez, there was he had all in all, he played maybe a game and a half or 2 games bad. You can argue the second half against Birmingham, the first half against DC, and then the Houston game. That's basically all he didn't play well. Okay? He was insane. Okay? I mean, there's not much to say. This is a guy who had a bad O-line, yet didn't get sacked all that much, because he did what I really heavily punished T. Will and Case Cookus for not doing. That was throwing the ball away quick. Perez would throw the ball away much better than really any other QB in the league, and that helped him a lot. Yes, it was pretty much he was on a team that had a great offense, minus the O-line being questionable, and defense that, couldn't stop anything for most of the year. Perez was an incredible quarterback. In fact, even to this day, there's going to be, and even on the comments of this video, I'm expecting some people to say he should have been number 1, which just goes to show how good a season he really had despite not making the playoffs, despite only winning a few games. He was incredible, definitely deserves to be high on the list. It's hard for me to say anything negative about him this past season. I mean, it's one of those where now people are asking the question, was he the reason why so many of those receivers looked good, or were those receivers just good? It's a big question. You have to ask that because Perez really proved a lot of people wrong. Essentially, I always talk about it. Heading into the season, he ended up being what people thought AJ was going to be, and AJ ended up being what a lot of people thought Perez was going to be. AJ became the check down guy, the game manager, the guy that wasn't going to win you games. Whereas Perez became what people thought AJ was going to be, which is, this gunslinger who can win you games out of nowhere, who's going to throw all around the field. That was incredible, and that's why a lot of people really hope Perez returns next year. If I were to have one QB between Perez, McCarron, and Ta'amu return, I'd want Perez to return. He's the most fun to watch, and I think he's overall the best of the 3 at this point in time. So hopefully he returns, but we'll see. Number 1 is Adrian Martinez, to the surprise of absolutely nobody. For the 2nd straight year on my list, I have a Birmingham Stallions QB at number 1. I mean, was his championship game MVP debatable? Yes, you could have very much argued Ricky Person Jr. or Keawa Tizino could have won that award. He still did win it. It was debatable. He did have 3 TDs. It is what it is. What isn't debatable is the UFL MVP. Deserved it. All UFL QB deserved it. You got to remember, counting stat-wise, when you include rushing yards, he's right there with Perez, yet he played 2.5 games less than Perez. Remember, he was having those weird, he played a couple drives, then a half, then 1 game, then didn't play. He missed a lot of time on the field in terms of getting counting stats, yet he still finished right with Perez. I hate when people say, he had 600 less passing yards, and that's their argument. Because no, Martinez actually only had less than 100 less than Perez, because you have to include his league-leading 528 rushing yards. Remember, Alex Magoo was a crazy runner last year, but he didn't lead the league in rushing yards. Martinez led the whole league. Okay, that's remarkable. His 9.8 yards per rush by a country mile, number 1 in the entire league among 25 attempts. Then, of course, you have tied 8th in interceptions. He wasn't throwing too many interceptions. He only threw 3 all year. Granted, that was also because he didn't play, the whole year, but yeah. 3rd in passer rating, so he was still a very effective passer. Now, his completion percentage was the one stat that wasn't all that good, but every other stat was incredible. Yards per pass, 7.6 was 3rd in the league. And in the postseason, it was a postseason, okay? We all remember how poor he looked against Michigan, and that's why it made his championship game performance so much more special, because it was a huge debate, should he even start? And he ended up playing well enough and good enough really to be, at worst, the 3rd best player on the team, at best, the deserving championship game MVP. It was incredible. He still had 4 total TDs in the postseason. Granted, 3 of them were in the championship game, which shows what he did. Okay, the biggest difference in the championship game was Chase Garbers versus Adrian Martinez. Chase Garbers did not play to win the game. Martinez played to win the game. Martinez won it. He deserves the number 1 spot. So that'll do it. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell button to be notified as soon as I upload any videos. As now we're getting into the NFL preseason, I'm planning to do what I haven't really done that well the past couple years, and that's actually make some videos talking about UFL guys in the preseason. Again, let me know what your top 10 players of the past season was down below in the comments. Do you agree or disagree with my list? Any spots you have that you think should be different? Is the Justin Hall pick a W? I think it's a good pick that he deserves to be that high. Do you think not? Let me know down below. And as always, guys, have a great night.